All right, let's get the debate underway. Speaking times are as they have been every other round, unless something truly radical has changed. So that will be up to 7 minutes with a bell at 1 minute and a bell at 6 minutes, two bells at 7. In lieu of bells, I'll try and put timestamps in the chat. Between the first and 6 minutes, POIs can and should be offered to teams and by teams. We will default by doing POIs in the chat. If you have a specific way you'd like to do POIs or would rather like to receive POIs, please indicate that before you start your speech. Other than that, if there are no other questions, I think we'll get the show on the road. So the motion before the House today is this House believes that the LGBTQ plus movements in developing countries should integrate patriotism into their messaging. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to speak to the motion that stands in their name. Hear, hear.
Hello, sorry. Am I audible? Oh, why is there a green screen, Riv?
Sorry, I was recording.
Okay, sorry. I hope this is not disruptive for anyone. How do you remove this? And sorry. So for POIs, you can raise them in the chat. I will take it at 5. Please indicate that you want to raise a POI though, so that I know to take it. Otherwise, I won't fault with POI. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. To be very clear, the context of this debate exists in the developing world, which is largely defined by religious and nationalistic sentiments. There are movements geared towards the acceptance of gender minorities, but they are very ineffective for the following reasons. The first is that a lot of people who are gender conforming feel threatened by the LGBT community. There is a misconception that if you are an LGBT individual, you are vastly distinct because you are defined by your sexuality, when in reality it is just a subset of who you are. Secondly, there's also the notion that this movement is akin to Western liberal values encroaching on their country's culture and sovereignty. And not just because the West was one of the first who broadly recognized LGBT rights. Conservative countries think that all LGBT movements are propagandas to corrupt traditions and norms of the developing state. As such, they antagonize LGBTs in their country as those who are corrupted, have no respect, or people who are just trying to proliferate this and trying to encroach on the country's culture and sovereignty. Even if there is acceptance of this community, a lot of it is largely tokenistic, right? A lot of the acceptance in the developing world is usually akin to those of parlor gays, like gay people or LGBT akin people are usually comedians, people who you laugh at rather than with. This context is important as it proves that existing narratives fail due to the large proliferation of these conceptions of LGBT people, but we also identify that these are the specific and nuanced problems that exist. In response to this, open government solution is very simple. We would rather have the integration of patriotism in the LGBT movement, not to say that you can be a patriot, you can be nationalistic while also being queer or while also being gay. Likely, I think we would do this strategically, especially because the motion insinuates that this would be an integration, and so there are probably strategic ways we can do this with the sealness. The goal is very simple, right? It is ensuring the baseline civil rights for LGBT individuals and the baseline empathy and concerns from moderates for political change. I have a simple one argument under 2 levels on why this nationalism is likely to be effective on the level of the movement itself and why this is likely to be effective for the country. First level, why is this effective for the movement? So a lot of people in these countries feel a lot of cognitive dissonance. They are afraid to tap into their inclinations to be gender non-conforming because at the same time, they don't want to sacrifice their community, their nationalism, etc. In fact, a lot of the time, this leads to them feeling like they have to overcompensate by being anti-LGBT because they try so hard to repress aspects of themselves that they feel is immoral, that they feel as though their state has told them is something that is not a good thing to be, that it is not part of the values that we want to align with as a state, right? This also creates a self-perpetuating cycle on the individual level. People feel like they are betraying their values and morals by being LGBT. They repress this aspect of themselves and they don't come out. And as a result of this, they also don't give representation to other people, and it makes it all out harder for other people to come out as well. And this is particularly pernicious because a lot of the people who, for example, join the military or join the police or other extremely hyper-masculine or hyper-feminine jobs feel the need to hide if they are part of the LGBT community because they feel as though this is a part of them that they simply cannot reconcile, that my sexuality or who I want to conform to or like the gender I want to conform to is something that simply cannot be reconciled with the job or the profession, and I can only choose one. And as a result, they also don't represent themselves in these positions. They are afraid of, for example, being fired, or for example, they are afraid of experiencing harassment in locker rooms because of their identity, which is why they would rather choose to not come up. We are able to ensure that they can rectify this internal conflict when they are able to see representation that actually you can be nationalistic and be LGBT. That is not true that just because you are part of this community, you are not just like trying to like proliferate a lot of Western paraphernalia. It's just a identity that you are valid in, etc., etc., right? I think this leads to also why this likely to be effective for the country itself, right? Given that the reason why it is usually that these people are so repressed in these countries is that there are a lot of individuals in these developing countries who feel indifferent towards the movement. They usually aren't that participative because they don't feel closely to this movement. Perhaps they don't have any friends or relatives who are LGBT adjacent. They don't think it is something that concerns them at all. Why are they likely to be swayed on open government? The first is, I think nationalism in and of itself is best strengthened through the unification of civilians under a common goal. It is dependent on accruing critical mass. And insofar as in these developing countries, there is usually a very strong nationalistic sentiment that I don't think anyone in this round can contest. It is a good thing that we encroach on this sentiment then by showing how you can integrate nationalism with being part of the community. It is mutually beneficial then for non-LGBT people and LGBT individuals, given that gender-conforming individuals see that these LGBT people or this community is not a threat. They see that these people are like more people are coming out. They feel closer relationship to the community, even if they maybe don't have friends who are part of the community. They can at least see how valuable these people are because they see more people being able to represent them. They see at least that there are more people choosing to come out, while at the same time there are people who are still being patriotic, etc. Especially if we have people in these positions, such as the military, such as the police, coming out, proving success stories to people who are non-conforming. Even if these people are not swayed, at the very least, I think people are simply likely to be more tolerant. Like the thing is, like a lot of these people, given that they are very nationalistic, simply want to see that people are still dedicated to their country, right? And I think that if they're able to see this, then a lot of the attacks they would have against LGBT individuals are far less, meaning they're likely to at least, like, if not like overtly discriminate them, at least not say those types of things because they have a lot less comments to make about them, a lot less negative things to say about them when they see a lot of those things are simply untrue. Why is this important? We can at least guarantee the most basic rights and protections of LGBT individuals on government side. But before I move on, I will take the POI from closing opposition if there is one.
Should the movements then be also critical of gays that are not patriotic?
No, I don't think so, right? Like just because we show that you can be patriotic and like gay, that doesn't mean that we have to like say that we are against people who are not nationalistic, right? I think that like it's simply that we are doing what the motion asks us to do, right? Which is simply that we would rather create like these different types of fronts. Obviously, movements can have different fronts, right? And I think that is a likely thing that happens in status quo anyway. And I don't understand why you're trying to push that coming from CEO. That's unstrategic. You should probably drop that right now. Impact is very simple. So I think moderates not completely understand the LGBT identity because it is impossible or unstrategic in terms of how it is framed in status quo. However, they're able to empathize with the community through shared cultural values because we show how nationalism and being part of the community is better. Like, for example, if you feel comfortable in your sexuality or your gender, you are far more likely to help out your country because maybe you are in a better mental state or whatever, etc. Nationalism also instills obligations to their countrymen because they are a fellow citizen. This means that we can minimize the worst instances of abuse. In these countries, there's still usually a lot of violence against queer-dressing individuals in the streets. There's still widespread disowning of LGBT family members, pressure to become straight passing. At the very least, we make sure that parents will still accept their children. The LGBT movement in these areas feels safe enough on the streets to actually self-actualize and eventually come out. This is particularly important because we prove to you, number one, why we are good for it on the individual level. At the very least, people are able to better self-identify, better able to understand themselves, which I think leads to the multiplier effect of why this is better for the country as a whole in terms of being able to increase the positive acceptance of the people within the movement. But furthermore, we prove to you mechanistically why in particular it has to be patriotic values, given that this is what is widespread, this is what is most accepted in these countries. And we showed you how these individuals can probably still be whatever they want to be, what identity they want to be, while also being nationalistic as a whole. With this proposed. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to welcome the opposition leader to begin the case for the upbench. Here.
I'll assume I'm still audible, just gonna get notes in order. I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. OD tried to tell you in this debate that nationalists and those ideas are now going to support the LGBTQ movement. I don't think they're engaging in the trade-off of actually how this movement is able to get change and what types of people actually make up the movement who supports this type of rights as a whole. What we're going to prove to you down op bench, and most of rebuttal will be integrated, just clashing with the points we get. What we're going to tell you down op bench is why the actual structure of the LGBT movement in these nations is dependent on A, cross-movement support and the ability to coalesce different issues together for political and on-the-ground support, and B, international mutual aid, and why that's cut off on their side of the house. Before getting to those two cases, 2 pieces of framing. First, on the actual structure of these movements, who supports them, who doesn't, and secondly, the mechanisms through which this movement is able to get change. Firstly, on the structure of the LGBTQ movement, I go ahead and note, I think there's broadly three groups that are mostly invested in perpetuating these types of civil rights and just like the ability for these people to access the normal rights that everyday citizens of these nations access. Firstly, LGBTQ people themselves, queer individuals and their families, people who are most proximate to the harms these people face every day in their lives, and the emotive capacity for these people. Oh, POI in the chat, by the way. So sorry, I forgot to frame that at the top. These people who actually experience these harms on the everyday. Second, I actually think the labor movement is very, very key in lots of these nations in order to perpetuate these rights. And this can look like equality clauses being put forth by labor unions, right? Where you can't ask about their sexuality or their gender identity or expression in a job interview, or just literally the ability to go ahead and ban discrimination in the workplace, because quite obviously the ability to access, physical capital for your everyday lives and your jobs is very important to the just physical ground conditions of queer people as well. Also, thirdly, other rights groups, like just broadly other left-wing advocacy groups, this also importantly looks like independence, anti-government, and separatist movements in a lot of these nations. These are people who are most likely to be able to have actual physical mechanisms of support for these different types of movements and advocacy groups. This looks like very young people who are just more proximate to the types of media spheres that allows them to gain the most support and gain the most resources, gain the most people for the types of things they're advocating for. So how does this movement actually get changed on the second piece of framing? A, laws, legislation, coalition building, the ability to actually gain seats in office that allows them to influence genuine change in society. And B, social norms and just general acceptance. Quite obviously, this looks like, the LGBT movement being more seen in media. It's like, them being able to have favorable interviews and questions. It's about not having newscasters that only cover like the LGBTQ movement in a certain way. And C, community stasis. This looks like internally in LGBT people being able to identify themselves with other people in their community and not have to be scared of actually showing their identity on the street every day. The ability to gain a certain level of stasis with the people who are like you and have the same struggles. D, on the ground organizing. This looks like protests and strikes and actually going up to Capitol buildings and having the ability to say that these are the issues we want to put forth and this is what we're demanding of you as a group. I go ahead and note on OG on this. I think they try to say that LGBTQ status as a movement is something that you can coalesce others into believing is just correct and not wrong. But I go ahead and note that your status as an LGBT individual or as a movement, even when not connected to other left-wing movements, will still be seen as an infringement by the nationalist and religious stakeholders that they frame as important in this debate. This is a value or moral-based judgment that is so unlikely to be changed in the reverse, aka in support of. So what we'll tell you in our side of the house is the actual stakeholders who are likely to support these people, likely to have on-the-ground support or have on-the-ground actual legislative change, or that are cross-movement solidarity, and why that's really important. So the movement solidarity of the first case is two-pronged. First, internally, and second, in relation to other movements. So A, internally, I think pro-government narratives uniquely feel oppressive oppressive or just sketchy in the status quo to groups who have been directly harmed by the state. And I think this is so carried out by just proposing in general. A, when you literally have people who are gay who are also just actively supporting the military or actively supporting groups who just genuinely have committed severe harms against people in these nations. Or B, this looks like the silencing of independence. I think what this means overall is that we have people who are likely to have cross leftist ideologies that then feel like one part of them can now no longer coexist in the same movement who once supports them. I think this looks like patriotism being a necessary non-critique of the state. What this means is this is empirically likely to cause schisms in support of the entire movement. Why is this empirically bad? One, your resources for campaigning and behind one candidate become incredibly sparse because now we have multiple people within one group who previously could be not a single issue party, but they could advocate for multiple things on multiple levels, not only having one point of stasis for a community that was once very multifaceted. Two, physically on the ground, I think your ability to protest against the government becomes so much more severely just stacked against when the government is able to say, look, we have people in our ranks that are against you, and because they're literally just a physical hand of violence by the state in this sense for other advocacy groups as well. And three, I think the youth who are just inherently less likely to be nationalists and more likely to feel a very emotive connection for other rights groups who are also just in this movement already are so much less likely to support you now. This makes the people who are most likely to go out and protest, to be your on-the-ground support, to have your community stasis point that's able to make sure you can coalesce as a community for just genuinely just making physical change are so much less likely to support you. This means overall, I think your ability to get change and actual rights for these groups or have just a physical ability to maintain safety as an organization is so much less on their side of the house than it is on ours. Before I get into why cross-movement solidarity is important, I will take CG if they have one.
Don't you think patriotism can be a nationwide narrative that uniquely unites people across different right groups as a common narrative?
So I think uniquely, the rights groups we're talking about here that are really important are the ones who have been harmed by the state and less likely to be nationalists. Those are ones that are able to they're like very small issues when they coalesce together, are able to form a critical mass that is able to get change, whether that be legislation or whether that be on the ground physical support. So let's get into the cross movement support now. I think the types of movements that are likely to actually support the LGBT movement in their like abilities to get rights are the ones I framed out, right? It looks like the independents and separatists, or the people, or like the labor unions who are like just trying to get like equality legislation passed in the workplace. I think when you stop actively advocating for those concerns and actively campaign for the systems that have oppressed these people, what you're doing is inherently taking away your ability to then form so many different types of good support. This looks like A, coalitions genuinely not happening. You are directly stratifying yourself against the groups that have helped you get change in the past. And B, your support for concessions is going to go down significantly when the ability for you to gain a mass in order to be important to the majority, important to the nationalists who then are able to control policy making in these countries, you now have no critical mass to actually do this. The people who you're now coalescing to, the nationalists, are so less likely to actually be able to support you when you no longer have the critical mass to engage with them on this level. So quickly, I think international mutual aid is going to go down. No, disparate resources and support availability mean that on-the-ground conditions for mutual aid are controlled externally. I think when we have this external control, in instances where mutual aid is most important, they're not able to get it because now you're supporting a state that is oppressive, so oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I provide the Deputy Prime Minister up to review the case for the government bench. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. I meant to unmute and turn my camera off. You're audible.
Okay, thanks. I'll take a POI in chat, preferably from CO. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. O confuses two very important concepts for this debate work. They confuse nationalism with support for the current state or support for the current administration of government. In reality, nationalism is, as CG says, and we're going to hijack their POI, it is one of the strongest unifying narratives in support of what the ideals of the state are usually supposed to be. Lofty ideals such as acceptance for everyone, basic human rights for everyone, which all people can relate to because whatever problems that the state is imposing upon them seem like a violation of the nation's ideals and therefore run counter to nationalism. So if all OO wants is to hold the current government accountable and therefore have intersectional support between groups against the current government, we can do that with nationalism. Because in reality, what OO wants to achieve is to, it never actually proves why we get a more a relatable narrative to them, because they never addressed, but we told you what the counterfactual is. We told you that firstly, LGBT movement is most likely very liberal and foreign to the other groups within the nation, right? Even if there are youth movements, for example, in these developing countries, because it is a developing country, influenced by the religious context, the gender norms context that my partner told you about, they are more likely to still be conservative, and all they want more likely is youth representation for their own ideals, and not exactly a reverse of nationalist sentiment and the traditional ideals of the nation, right? What this means then is that they will not relate to our minority struggles. They will not relate to the current narratives of the needs of the LGBT people, because they think that the state, their political power is limited and they probably have to use it for their own ideals. It's only when we invoke nationalism that everyone is truly unified. We can invoke the support of labor groups, right? Because nationalism basically talks about the support of the economy, right? It necessarily means that the country needs to be prosperous, and therefore that everyone needs to have equal rights, provided for them. You can relate to the youth, because for the government to probably function, or for the state to function, we need representation of all groups. And if there is minority quotas among these kinds of youth groups, then necessarily, you can campaign for both representation of all minorities in that sense, right? just really quickly to preempt CO's case, right? When they had a trap POI about whether or not we will force LGBT individuals who will want to be patriotic. What we told you is that no, we don't necessarily need to do that. And this also responds to OO, because realize, we acknowledge that movements are intersectional, right? Just because there's splintering of movements does not mean that that there are different ideals or values within a movement, does not mean that they're taking away from one another. There are multiple branches of feminism, for example. There's choice feminism, there's religious feminism in acknowledgement of developing world context, and the fact that they're simply different, and yet there is still something that unifies them, which is the joint struggle of being like championing women's rights in society, right? It just acknowledges the multiplicity of identities to be able to have multiple fronts, and so we don't need to force individuals, right? If you are not necessarily nationalistic, that's fine. What my partner told you is that it's just important for people to acknowledge that nationalism can be compatible with LGBT rights, and therefore we can use messaging in the most important context, right? That's why we think that even if not all members necessarily agree with this kind of nationalist messaging, or they're not necessarily nationalistic, they understand the goal of this nationalistic messaging. The fact that it's reaching out to individuals with cognitive dissonance, people who hate themselves because they have this internalized oppression and they are nationalistic and they think that has a conflict with their own identity, right? There is enough empathy within members of the movement to be fine with the fact that we're reaching out to more of our own members and more outgroups with this nationalist sentiment. But more importantly, if we do have to force individuals to take a stand to have a more unified and strong liberal approach, why can we justify this, right? Firstly, because society would naturally force these people to be patriotic on either side, right? We do not want to embolden our members in these developing countries to do something as dangerous as to oppose state narratives, right? On opposition, you are providing these individuals false hope that, for example, you can challenge the state, and it is actually through these protests and storming of state institutions that Ella was trying to talk about will be successful, because my partner gave you multiple structural reasons as to why these will fail, right? We need to teach and educate our members within the movement to have more empathy and to realize the intersectionality, and realize that what's most important is baseline protections for all members, right? For individuals who have conservative family members, we need to branch out to them. Even if we put nationalism before our own ideals, at least we make sure that they are less abused, that they're more willing to express their identity, right? And this is where we take a final, we finally defend the trade-off we're willing to take, right? Even at the worst case, right? If we don't succeed in pushing the most liberal of agendas for the LGBT movement, why is it okay? Firstly, because it's better for LGBT individuals themselves. There's still this dominant assertion on OO that the majority of individuals will probably be anti-nationalist, perhaps because the state themselves has oppressed them. Sure, the state may have oppressed them, but again, their internalized oppression does not allow them to process that properly. They still think that it's their own fault and that they're probably committing religious sins, or they're attacking and destroying conservative institutions, which is why it's their own fault. And therefore, it's better for LGBT individuals themselves, on our side, the vast majority of them who have some internalized nationalism, to feel like they have a safe space within the movement, the fact that they can be open with their nationalism, and then we can probably try to educate them on liberal values later on. Secondly, in terms of greater discourse, right, the fact that prerequisite to bargaining power for, having more radical reforms of the state is to have support from moderates, right? And on a grassroots level, if we're able to relate to these individuals and have these conversations with them to educate them about their identity, which they're willing to listen to because they think that, there is something that relates them, and that's when they're going to be able to understand the LGBT identity for them to ask for more radical reforms. I'll take CO. Do you have anything?
Yes, there are multiple branches of any movement, but if one of the branches is tied with a force as strong as the state, don't you think that specific branch ought to be the dominating one?
The whole start of the speech was about how we can fight the corrupt state using the banner of nationalism. That's why opposition groups take the nationalist party name and stuff like that. But more importantly, on the extension, right? Firstly, why is this good for principled consistency, right? Because the movement cannot stand its own legs unless it is consistent with its principles. Why are we still consistent with our principles of the state? Firstly, we're putting members at the forefront because we know the pulse of the people, that the people are more likely going to be nationalistic. We are empowering them to determine what the identity of the LGBT movement will be. We don't lock them out in that sense. But more importantly, it also leads to more localization of LGBT movements and grassroots support. Again, my partner told you that most change for these liberal movements is contingent on Western ideations of LGBT movements, which are obviously hyper-liberal and will not receive any support from the state because they think that it's a imperialist imposition, right? In this case, we're able to develop these local LGBT movements using messaging that is relatable to our members on the ground and allows them to have their own movement that prioritizes and forwards their agenda first. They don't need to push for third wave feminism or third wave of LGBT acceptance in which gender roles are completely destroyed, but they can at least have better legislation to prevent things like abuse. They can at least make sure that they're like no one can be disowned just for their identity. Those are most important. Those are most empowering. OG.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now welcome the Deputy Opposition Leader to conclude the top half of today's debate. Here.
I presume I'm audible. Cool. Right, our case is pretty simple and it's debate winning. The groups that historically have offered the most support to the LGBT movement, particularly in developing countries, tend to be anti-military, anti-nationalist, anti-government, and often oppressed minorities that are likely to be separatist. Literally at the point at which all of the mechanisms in the info slide are, I mean, what were they? Like LGBT soldiers supporting them. Literally the military is a facet of the state, like to a great extent actually supporting the military is implicitly supporting the actions of the military. See like the amount of support that the military goes up or down depending on like what they're doing. See like the UK military being incredibly unpopular after the Iraq war, but like I don't know, more support after the Falkland War. It's just tied to the state. Like national symbols are also just always related to the state. Like not criticizing nationalism, literally also mentioned in the info slide. I think implicitly you're supporting it if you're not criticizing it, particularly in instances when like nationalist governments are doing particularly egregious things like oppressing minorities, like oppressing gay people, and also crucially independence movement, given that there is a huge amount of separatist movements in a huge amount of countries that fucking hate the ruling government, that have oppressed them centuries, generationally, and I just think there's absolutely no chance at the point at which you're saying actually we like this group, at the point at which you're being explicitly pro them, or you're not even giving them any word of support when historically they're likely to have supported you. You're likely to just have all of your existing support collapse, and then all of government's case is predicated on the idea that maybe moderates will support them. I think the analysis for actually proving this is incredibly limited. Like I just don't actually see how they get the jump between people are more likely to be more sympathetic if they understand that they're like you to, you know, you're not going to get like hate crimed at work as a like policeman or like as a young LGBT person in a family that's like tending to be oppressive. You get good things. I'll go line by line through opening government. Like basically people hide in straight jobs because of fear of pushback. People are going to do that anyway, even at the point at which the LGBT movement is nationalist, because there are just going to be homophobic people. I don't think they've actually proven that you're going to get a massive reduction in the amount of homophobia that exists. I just think people will maybe understand the more likely, but it doesn't deal with a core thing of people are fundamentally opposed to the idea of like someone being gay is an immoral thing. That probably just means that those people are likely to do that. I also think at the point at which like crucially you actually get that change is literally just like legislating on the fact that they're actually going to like, you know, say you literally cannot do this. It is like against the rules of this workplace to oppress these people. So you cannot do that, which is more likely to change on our side. Then we get the idea of like, oh, tension between being nationalist and being gay, basically, and the two things are seen as mutually exclusive. I actually think it's kind of unlikely in states that are deeply homophobic that people are going to feel like this incredibly strong sense of like love or affection or care towards the government when the government are like saying it is immoral to be gay in these places. And I think at the point at which the government isn't saying that, at the point at which the government is actually reasonably tolerant to gay people, I don't know why then there is this massive internal contradiction. Like I don't know why that's something that people are particularly fearful of. Then you get kind of analysis like they'll see patriotic and gay people and empathize. I'm not sure how mutually exclusive that is. I just think explicitly the movement isn't supporting these people. Like presumably you can have, you know, gay people in the military on both sides of the house. I just think you're less likely to get support from a movement on supporting those people on our side. So I think that's at the very least mitigated. I also think crucially ignoring the trade-off, literally all of the people that are like, I don't know, like socialist rebels, that are like big iconic left-wing separatist people that are also gay, that your movement explicitly isn't supporting, or is supporting instead people that fucking hate those people. You're just not going to get the support from those people. Then we get, you know, internalized oppression. I think this also changes with societal change, right? I think the biggest way that you actually get an amount of change on societal oppression is literally just like having, you know, like just a normalized acceptance, an education curriculum, which is better for people, or like literally someone to talk to about this, literally safe spaces. So I just don't think that works. I also think the pushback that we get on this is like, oh, labour unions are likely to be pro-gov. Sure, even if some of them are, I think often a lot of them aren't. I think given that they're literally attacked and opposed by the government, like their issues likely to be in conflicts with the military and the police, and they're just like literal likelihood that people that are in trade unions are likely to be left-wing, anti-nationalist types. I just think it's incredibly unlikely that they're going to be supportive of this type of message. So I just don't think that actual response works. Impacting this case then. So like on the actual metrics that you get change, I think policy, protest, safe spaces, and long-term movement change. Like in terms of policy, that I don't think they give any actual likelihood of to why moderates are likely to do change. I think even if you just have small left-wing parties that are like anti-nationalist, socialist, that are pushing on the government, that are lobbying to do this, which is so much more likely, because I just don't think, given that the right has like literal democratic mandates of probably like likely to be homophobic people, I'm unsure how you're actually going to get them to do that. I think it's just so much more likely that the left will. But even in terms of the scale of that change, I think the amount and quality of the actual progression for rights that they're likely to do is just so much more likely to be very, very ambitious. Like they're just so much more likely to do things like, you know, gender recognition for trans people rather than just being like, oh, maybe like, you know, just like signaling that it's okay to be gay. Like I actually think substantial change happens from people that tend to be radically anti-government, that tend to be quite radical, that tend to be opposed to the military. I also think in terms of protest, the right patriotic nationalist people are just never going to go out and fucking protest the government. I don't understand how you're actually going to get any support. People that are anti-government, separatist, left-wing are. I think at the point at which you piss them off because you support people that don't like them, they're just not going to support you. That means literally things like getting out on the street, getting support, getting national attention for your movement, for something that's important to you, is just so much less likely to happen. Thirdly, in safe communities, I think a lot of these coexist with, you know, literally just people on the left, literally people that are like anti-government, anarchists, communists. I think at the point at which you're explicitly messaging against them, I think you're so much less likely to get support. You're so much less likely to get taken in by these groups. At the point at which like your family isn't supporting you, they get chucked out of your house because you're gay or you're trans. I think that's literally life and death for tens of thousands of people in deeply homophobic places where they're not going to get that support. I'll take a POI from closing.
So as the LGBTQ movement, is it not politically strategic to align with the majority, which has more political capacity to bring?
No, it's just not. I just don't think, first of all, it's like large trade-offs here. I think a huge amount of people in a lot of countries that are just like separatists aren't like a very small minority. There's fucking loads of them. Look, I don't know, like a country like Nigeria where you have an enormous separatist movement that don't like the government. Like, I just don't think people that are going to be more likely to be right-wing, more likely to be homophobic are actually likely to get any change. All of the analysis is proving this. Then in terms of long-term movement normalization, I think there's two really important things here. Firstly, you're just more likely to get right-wing parties actually going into government at the point at which, you know, you're just saying like, these are good things, and you're putting this to like quite large amount of LGBT youth. That's probably long-term harmful for you because they're just more likely to be homophobic. Secondly, if you do actually get any separatism, if you do actually get the government collapsing, say, I don't know, the state falls apart and there is a separatist state that then comes into existence, there's a civil war, these people will fucking hate you. These people won't just be like as oppressive as the status quo, they will be more oppressive than the status quo because you've actively opposed them. This looks like, I don't know, at the point at which there is like, you know, I don't know, in Somalia where the government is, your LGBT movement is saying, yeah, we love the state, and then the Somaliland breakaway happens. It probably looks like them being like, fuck you, we like all the gay people were opposed to us. This is a massive, massive harm to these movements. I think this is just absolutely disastrous. Unironically, like, yeah, proud to oppose, because this is just a fucking stupid idea.
Thank you very much for that speech. Thank you to everyone in the top half. I'd like to welcome, excuse me, the government member to begin the closing half of today's debate. Here.
Hi, am I audible? Thank you. I prefer POIs in the chat, please. Okay. Speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Oshi's idea is that people will come out on government paradigm because they think patriotism and LGBTQ identities can coexist. Then people will be more accepting of the movement. I think they lack the crucial underlying mechanism to prove why this integration would actually be effective to the extent that the general population will suddenly become unified or become supportive of the movement as a whole. They just assert that nationalism can be compatible. They don't explain why this is the most likely scenario. And I think this is the premise for all of their impact scan in the debate, which is what I'm going to be extending as member of government, right? But before I get into that, like just a quick framing, I'm going to actually give structural reasons on why the vast majority of the population, including on the ground LGBTQ individuals, actually do support patriotism, especially in the context of developing countries, which is the motions like which is where the motion takes place, right? Like there's three things to know here. First, a lot of developing countries have gone under like years of colonial rule, right? And this means that they oftentimes have years of shared suffering as a common group of people that have gained independence from an oppressive Western country or whatever country that colonized them. This necessarily means that a lot of people feel the identity that they have gone through a shared suffering, and now they are uniting as common people. This translates in many ways to nationalistic narratives and patriotic narratives on the ground to this day. Secondly, they oftentimes still run under a strong government. This sometimes looks like a dictatorship. It looks like people from dynasties still holding a lot of control. Generally, a lot of politicians with a cult of personality, they oftentimes stress national identity in order to unite their voter bloc or to unite the people that they are ruling over. This again translates in many ways to patriotic narrative, saying that you as a citizen should feel pride in being able to contribute to your government or to your people or to your dynasty, etc., etc. Thirdly, I think that in a lot of developing countries, they have gone under things like ethnic conflict, or there is religious division, or like a lot of division within the country. This again places huge incentive on the current government to unite the people, and patriotism is the most effective way to do so because it's a common narrative that pushes on the people to think that, oh, it's beneficial for me, or it's very like it gives me a lot of joy to be able to contribute to the country or to feel like I'm a citizen of this particular country. This, for example, looks like under in sectors of education, a lot of children getting indoctrinated with patriotic narratives, learning about their national anthem and their history, for example, uniting, and things like stress narratives and glorification of patriotism on things like international sporting events and things like general political discourse in the media, etc., etc. Why then would integration be effective under this scenario? I'm going to talk about generally four mechanisms here. The first thing to know is that we're able to gain more public appeal as the LGBTQ movement on our side of the house. This is because, firstly, your patriotism as a narrative makes it very easy for you as a movement to create stories, to glorify LGBTQ plus individuals in order to spread a positive image among the public. For example, a particular LGBTQ individual protecting its nation during conflict or in war zones, for example, soldiers coming home stories, all of this are very easy narratives that creates a lot of story that resonates with people, that creates sympathy and support, and something that the general public who has already internalized patriotism because of all the framing that I gave you to like support, right? But the second thing is that it's easier for the general public to see commonalities. Recognize that we're shifting the attention of the general public not from like supporting the LGBTQ identity itself, which we do concede still has a lot of stigma, but rather to supporting a fellow citizen who shares the same suffering of colonialism or conflict, who shares the same heartwarming stories of, for example, soldiers contributing in war zones, of winning a medal in the Olympics, for example. So we're able to shift public attention to the positive images, and we're able to tie those narratives around the particular LGBTQ plus individuals. This is the point in which we're actually able to prove that patriotic narratives are compatible with certain LGBTQ individuals, right? The importance here is that majority support literally translates to actual voter support for things like legislation. For example, anti-discrimination laws or preventing assault. This is the most important issue in this debate, because although we do agree that coming out and accepting your identity is in itself an important impact from OG, the impact that we propose about things like legislative support and the mechanism for that, it's a prerequisite to come out in the first place. You can't come out when there's no risk of getting, like, you can only come out when there's no risk of getting shunned from your community, when there's no risk from getting bullied at school or getting fired from work. We provide the mechanism for why this would happen. We already take this above OG, right? But the second thing to know is why we're able to tap into the most powerful individuals in society. For example, the conservative rulers and the politicians. This is because we can stress your contribution as a citizen and to connect it to being LGBTQ+. This is crucial because it taps into the most conservative images on the ground. So I think like ideologically, many people will not be able to change their negative sentiment or towards the LGBTQ+. So maybe they would just not accept someone for being gay. But on our side, we uniquely give these people a reason to pragmatically protect the LGBT population. Because when you're able to see an LGBT soldier contributing in war zones and getting glorified by the movement using patriotic narratives on our side of the house, this is the point in which the most conservative people also find pragmatic reasons to at least make sure that LGBTQ+ individuals have the basic safety and social opportunities so that they can contribute to the nation, right? This is important because it takes OO at best. So even if the deepest biases remain the same on our side of the house, we at least give the majority and the most conservative and powerful individuals a reason to support LGBT individuals to the extent that they can also contribute to the patriotic narratives and contribute to the nation as a whole. The third thing to know is that we're able to provide more inclusion of people on the ground. The premise here is that patriotic narratives resonates with the average LGBT individual who is not necessarily indoctrinated indoctrinated with Western values. Recognize that the majority of the people who identify as LGBTQ in developing country context might not just understand the micro labels of different sexual identities if they just didn't have the opportunity to gain access to things like liberal media and liberal social movements. On our side of the house, it's easier for them to gain information about their identity and information about the movement at the point in which, for example, you're able to see your flag next to the pride flag when you see hashtags on social media connecting your national identity and patriotic values to your identity as an LGBTQ plus citizen. That's the point in which you're able to gain knowledge about your identity. And this makes it also easier for you to opt in and support the movement as a whole. Sorry, time. This is important because you're able to learn about your identity, which is, again, one of the most crucial fundamental rights for your self-actualization. We achieve this better. We're able to resonate with the most vulnerable individuals on the ground. But fourthly, on the unity of the movement, recognize that there's also division within the LGBTQ plus movement or between different rights group, which is the context of OO within the status quo. For example, trying to exclude trans people from the movement, or like having conflict over who gets to be included under what kind of micro label, et cetera, et cetera. Or especially when it's post-conflict or in ethnically or religiously diverse nations, there's division within the LGBTQ community who have conflicting identities, right? On our side of the house, patriotism is a narrative that all sections of the movement and all sections of different right group movements can also support. They can collectivize easily and garner and push for rights much more strategically on our side of the house at the point in which they can unify for things like riots or things like petitions and marches much better under a common narrative for all these reasons proposed.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome the opposition member to begin the case for the opposition. Here.
Hello, can I check if I'm audible and visible?
Yep. Loud and clear and visible.
All right. For PY, it's gonna take one at around 5:45. No sooner than that. Visit your voice, please. I cannot see the chat. All right. Sean, can you play? Okay. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I will first answer a very important question. How will conservative groups and institutions likely respond to side affirmatives proposed messaging? Number one, we disagree that the reception of this message will be positive and favorable to the movement. Why is this the case? Sure, the response of the society will be varied, but predominantly, there's going to be skepticism and resistance. To prove why this is the likely response, let's first answer on what conditions do conservative developing countries despise and resent members of the LGBTQ community. Number one, taking affirmative benches like piece of characterization on how the general conduct and political views of the majority of people within these countries are dictated by deep-rooted culture and tradition of collectivism, characterized by hard and stubborn standards of belongingness to such communities. Taking that specific piece of characterization, we don't get any mechanization from the opening government, like proving that all of a sudden, people will be willing to suspend these beliefs, suspend these views in order to welcome members of the LGBT community. Second, we say it's highly unlikely for tolerance and for like welcoming reception to emerge from this kind of messaging, because conservative groups in the form of families and religious communities, like state instruments and bureaucratic agencies, etc., they're first and foremost answerable to their own intuition of what is right based on what they have been taught their whole life. So conservative nationalist groups do not have the incentive to express support from sectors and groups whom they believe will trigger backlash. A conservative pro-nationalism politician, for example, whose station in the government was earned and won from courtship of largely and predominantly conservative voter bases, won't like just automatically risk the next election's winning odds to sound and express support for the movement. Thirdly, even throwing patriotic messaging into the mix, we believe that the more likely responses would be further alienation of the movement and further revulsion among the conservative majority or the general public. It's more likely for the public to view the messaging in the form of marrying the national flag and the LGBT flag as profane and irreverent even. Why is this the more likely response? For example, when people have persona imagined their sworn protectors as these strong macho individuals, side affirmative messaging would certainly stir skepticism among like people when it comes to the ability of queer members of the military, like their ability to discharge their duties to the state, for example. So it's overwhelmingly unclear from side affirmative just how radically the culture within the LGBTQ movement and the public like would change as a result result of the patriotic messaging. So this messaging implies like accepting the refusal of offices to grant the permits to hold rallies and protests, for example. Otherwise, the movement would risk receiving backlash and being perceived as inconsistent if we try and refuse to accept that decision from like, these offices, for example. So this messaging also implies censorship of like subversive content from like tackling LGBTQ concerns, especially in the hands of authority, because a lot of the abuse is experienced in the hands of authorities. Like historically, state apparatuses and the police force, for example, have been the same weapons used by leveraged by the state to wage war against minorities. Deputy Prime Minister a while ago tried to preempt this by saying that patriotic messaging does not necessarily equal allegiance to say an authoritarian or an unjust government for that matter, but the two are almost interchangeable. Why is this the case? In classrooms, for example, we like the photos of the president are mounted on walls as personification of like patriotism. So you see this in public schools, for example. The government in developing democracies, albeit weak ones, because certainly this debate cannot happen elsewhere, the government therein is popularly elected at best or monopolizes information and media so that nationalism/patriotism is skewed in favor of the government. So we say that like the response will most likely be unfavorable for the movement. Now, how do we then delineate ourselves from the top half? The top half ended with a deadlock on the issue of support, with OG and CG arguing that aligning with the prevalent narrative, which is nationalism, to which the majority of people in these countries gravitate, this would earn the government, this would earn the LGBT movement a stronger political capital and better social traction, while opening opposition response to this by saying, oh, well, we can get support elsewhere, it can be found elsewhere, like international aid, for example, and anti-government militant groups, for example, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, closing opposition will enter this debate, like breaking this deadlock by arguing the following. We argue that patriotism is inherently irreconcilable with ideals of the LGBT movement and is therefore anti-minority. And we're going to further argue that patriotism is actually a weak narrative to piggyback on if you want to hold the country together into a unified front against the abuses of the state, for example. Why is this the case? Patriotism is a weak narrative to piggyback to ride on, because developing countries are also the same countries notorious for declining and deteriorating trust and confidence in the government. So imagine having an economy that's weak, that no longer serves your interest, for example, having schools schools whose educational system is substandard compared to that of the other countries, for example, having healthcare system that's weak and doesn't really serve your needs, for example. We did that at this point, in developing countries, even if we say that, oh, we pledge allegiance to the flag, still this kind of condition that exists within these countries makes it easy and makes it logical to infer, therefore, that patriotism might be actually the last value that people would care about. We think that the greater value, the better value that people will likely care about, and actually more universal value, are human rights, for example, human rights and peace, for example, and all those kinds of things. So this is we think that we co-opt the benefits of the entire side affirmative bench by piggybacking on a more universal value that doesn't necessarily clutch onto something that's weak and futile. Before I proceed, yes, POI from Gov.
If we do have to be willing to pander to the current government, you're giving us the reason why. You said that there's conditioning of citizens and that conservative institutions are so strong. So if the liberal movements are weak and human rights are not bad because it's backwards, it's more strategic to pander to politicians and try to get some representation because everyone is so nationalistic, because we can't get an opposition.
I didn't realize it was out of order already, so I'm not going to respond to that anymore. But yeah, moving on. Anyway, I'm going to answer that still in the next discussions. But yeah, continuing, we think that ultimately we're able to co-opt all side affirmatives benefits. How do we do that? I think that patriotism for them ultimately means unity, right? But we think we can also hold the people together under one banner by advocating for human rights, for example, human rights which also resonates with other members of the minority, by people below the poverty line, for example, who have been treated inhumanely by their economic conditions, for example. These kinds of things, the kind of condition that is extremely prevalent within these developing countries, we think we can also ride on that specific narrative without risking any form of backlash within the movement. So for those reasons and more, please vote closing opposition. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that speech. A reminder that POIs can only be offered and accepted between the first and 6th minute, not afterwards. I'd now like to invite the government whip up to conclude today's government bench. Hear, hear.
Okay, hi, I hope I'm audible and visible, and I prefer, thank you, POIs through the chat, please, and preferably at around the 5-minute mark. Okay, so in my speech in 3, 2, 1. So 2 ways in which a closing government is going to take this debate. Firstly, on the mechanism of structural change. Whereas OG just says that there's going to be generally more sympathy because patriotism is something that everyone likes, we structurally prove to you how political change happens through, for example, talking about analyzing the nature of narratives that patriotism promotes, or through like war hero stories or Olympic success stories. We tell you about how like these conservative groups, even if they don't change their minds, have selfish incentive to actually incorporate these, have political selfish incentive to actually incorporate these LGBTQ movements. We also talk about uniting micro-labels within LGBTQ movements. But we think that all of the, if all of these structural reasoning actually stands, and we are able to prove that structural change happens better on our side, we think that is the only, and that alone is actually, we say, is enough to take this entire debate. But secondly, as I will do in my whip speech, we will deal with the characterization clash that is coming from opening opposition, the characterization of the people who are likely to deviate from the movement as a result of incorporating the LGBTQ movement with patriotism. We think that through dealing with this characterization, we're going to significantly mitigate opening opposition impact. And we see that this also beats OG as well, because at the point of OG, they are unable to take the OO context at their very, very best. Okay, so firstly, I'll deal with closing opposition, and then secondly, I'll talk about, I'll engage with the OO on the characterization of the people who are likely to oppose against patriotism, and thirdly, I'll do some weighing, and if I have remaining time, I'll talk about the characterization of the people who are likely to stay in the movement and who are less likely to deviate. So firstly, just dealing with closing opposition, 3 materials. First, they say that conservative people won't change their mind. But this is not true because of all the analysis that came, not only my member speaker, but also from our top bench about how this sympathy is likely to happen. But also note that uniquely closing governments can win against this analysis, because even if we concede here that conservative people don't change their mind, we tell you that these people have selfish incentive to cooperate insofar as they for example, the patriotic right is not necessarily the majority, which means as like opposition benches want to claim. We think that in these situations, like for example, like the LGBTQ movement, which consists of roughly around 10% of the population, is largely enough to actually make a swing zone, or like be a casting board to actually sway to get policy through. We think that these people are likely to be a crucial political bloc that these selfish right politicians would be happy to cooperate against. Secondly, they said that patriotism is too weak to piggyback on because of weak economy, because of the corrupt state, etc. But note that patriotism is not about supporting the current regime, right? People can obviously weaponize patriotism and actually oppose the current regime. So we don't think that patriotism is necessarily about supporting current regime. But also what we say is that patriotism is actually promoted through the state across time and space, by for example, education from early ages, or through for example, media strategies. We think that patriotism is much more stronger than for example what they talk about like human rights, etc. Thirdly, the alternative that they had was, so on CO, they're going to piggyback on human rights, right? Firstly, it's not human rights and patriotism is not a trade-off. You have to talk about why that is the case. But secondly, it's not necessarily human rights is not necessarily widely familiar, right? It sounds Western, it sounds alien to these people in developing countries. But also thirdly, if incorporating human rights and making it their flag mark had been an effective strategy in the first place, they would have done that already. CEO has to explain why piggybacking on human rights, which is what their entire impact is reliant on, is going to be enough for them to win. Okay, so moving on to the characterization of the people who are opposed against patriotism. OO's characterization was as follows: separatist movements, independence movements, or labor movements. And okay, so let's mitigate this material. OG responds by just giving us an optimistic characteristic. So some new lines analysis from closing government. All the analysis that we heard from OG was that these like anti-government groups share one thing in common, which is that they are anti-government. There are three responses here. First, separatists and labor unions are not not intrinsically pro-LGBTQ. They are at best agnostic and even anti-LGBTQ because they're likely to be led by young, able-bodied men who have the capacity, for example, lead labor protests or have the capacity to lead separatist militia operations, etc. Even that comparatively, patriotism is more inclusive because it actually it's a narrative that incorporates people across genders or across women. And people throughout all of the country, you are part of this patriotism insofar as you have that nationality. But secondly, if OO wants to say that people don't support LGBTQ movements because of their bias, etc., that just means that separatists or labor unions will also not support LGBTQ movements. We think that their analysis kills their own impact. But thirdly, labor union groups are not likely to be opposed against nationalism insofar as the state has been promoting nationalist narrative through education or through media across time and space. So we really don't see why we ought to take the massive assertion coming from OO that anti-government movements are likely to just unite because they are anti-government. Before moving on to I'll just take opening opposition right now.
Right, you're missing the fact that these groups will actively hate you at the point at which you are actively supporting groups that have oppressed them. It doesn't matter if they're pro-LGBT in the first place, which they probably will be because oppressed people support other oppressed people in solidarity.
I mean, if everyone's oppressive, the most important consideration is political calculus, right? We think that at the point where these pro separatists or labor unions are the political minority, and the right-wing patriotism is the majority, the politically strategic choice for these LGBTQ movements is to align with the majority. We think that is the whole analysis that is missed, that OO and CO miss, that is coming from our member speaker. So finally, just a couple of materials of weighing. We say that firstly, even if on our side, there are we have to concede some crucial values of the liberal movements. We think that we're still able to achieve bare minimum important political advancement, right? Because in developing countries, the most fundamental rights for LGBTQ individuals are not given, or just passing legislation to make sure that they aren't physically hurt or they aren't assaulted. They are immediate benefits. There's a larger delta we can claim from this round, but also even if it excludes some people that are abused by the state, note that the most vulnerable people in this debate is actually the people who are patriots, but also they are, for example, queer or LGBTQ, right? Because they cannot internally reconcile these two identities. They cannot opt out because of patriotism, because of community cost or individual cost. So these people are currently unable to enter the LGBTQ movements because they are patriotic. I think that this demographic of people is the delta that's remaining on our side. For all these reasons, closing up.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now to wrap up today's debate, I'd like to welcome the opposition whip. Be here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yep, you're all good.
Okay. I'll just set up my timer. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. To be supportive of the military and the state instruments for oppression is to lay waste the lives of gays and queers they killed back then and the lives that they're still going to kill as long as this goes on. Closing opposition wins this debate on two fronts. First, we explained why this will hurt the movement more, i.e. there's no incentive for the people to accept in the very first place, and they would be seen as a bastardization of the state, for example. But number two, we explained that even if they cooperate, patriotism is a rather weak narrative to begin with when it is already surrounded with a lot of skepticism in developing countries, which was explained by my partner and unresponded to by the previous whip. I'm going to weigh first our material against opening opposition, right? Opening opposition told you that the ways as to which they can get change is through cross-movement support, i.e. getting the support from labor movements or getting the support from anti-state organizations and getting international support or whatsoever. All this do not amount to having more support than government bench suggested. In closing opposition, you do not have to buy that we will get more support as well. You just have to believe that the harms to the LGBT movement are overwhelmingly more compared to any margin of support that you will get in any other team in this round or whatsoever. But more importantly, I'd like to address or to first weigh this against what we heard from opening government, right? Because opening government told you what we heard from OG is that patriotism has been instrumental in oppressing the members of LGBT via propagandas. They missed out describing how the propagandas look like. Most of the time, gays are framed as enemies of the state, i.e., you are weak, you cannot be used in war, for example. They communicate these kinds of exclusionary narratives via machismo, for example, or via anti-minority narratives, which we explained in the member speech. The only way for the oppressors to successfully communicate homophobia is using other narratives like religion, patriotism as vehicles. This is why I asked, should the movement be critical of gays that are not patriotic as well? The reason why this question is important is because the movement is a spectrum and it thrives in the segments, for example, and having as much diversity as possible. The thing is, if one of the segments of the movement is tied with a very strong force like the state, other segments of the spectrum are likely to be either unattended or dissolved. And on both terms hurt the LGBT movement more and more. But the first claim, I'd like to just address the first claim coming from OG, right? Because I think it was unproven. The first claim they have is that movements are ineffective because majorities or gender-conforming individuals are threatened by gender minorities. And the second is that there are false propagandas, etc., etc. I would like to note that they aren't necessarily able to prove that the movement is unsuccessful. They just asserted that it is the case. Moreover, they have not presented any metric as to how a successful movement look like. In the other hand, in closing opposition, we would argue that we're able to get incremental successes already in the developing countries, i.e., many developing countries like the Philippines are able to lobby some senators that are trans women, for example, were also able to display same-sex relationships in media, i.e., the rise of BL media in Thailand, and even having franchises of Drag Race, a popular queer show in developing countries or whatsoever. Therefore, this is important because this tells you that there are also specks of successes in these kinds of movements, and therefore they cannot just automatically claim that the movement is failing or whatsoever. The second claim coming from opening government is that gays in the military cannot represent the LGBT because they are forced to choose between their identities. Two responses. First, if you're in a homophobic country and the movement tell their gay soldiers to openly celebrate it, you put them as targets of gender-related violence. That is a terrible idea if you truly care about them, because the greater threat to gay soldiers is not being forced to choose between their identities. The greater threat is the dangers of machismo, because they're in the center of the breeding ground of machismo to begin with. The additional message coming from closing government is that, the messaging allows those that want to come out to have some form of a support system, but they're unable to prove why this support system is going to be as strong as much as the strength of those oppressors that they have in the very first place. Therefore, even if you believe then that you'll have some form of support system, I don't think it is clear as to why that would be enough in the first place. The next thing that they said, and this is shared coming from closing government and opening government, is that patriotism is a unifying narrative because of how relatable it is, i.e., you'll be getting more discourse or whatsoever. The extension coming from closing gov is to explain why these are previous colonies, for example, and therefore share some form of value over the state. There are two responses to this. The first one is that they're unable to explain how this discourse even look like, because most of the time, these kinds of discourse also just hurt the minorities even more. I.e., in my partner's speech, we explained why if you put the two flags of LGBT flag with the flag of the state, for example, it would be seen as a bastardization of the state, because most of the time they communicate the love for the state with loving the machismo, the hyper masculine image or whatsoever. And it's also very important to note in this debate that government bench is adamant in clarifying the line between the patriotism and support to the government without explaining why a layman would see that line to begin with, especially in developing countries where most governments have a control over public education system, and they use these kinds of education system and media to communicate this narrative as one and thus the same side of the same coin, right? This means, therefore, that perhaps the line exists, but for an ordinary person, for a layman, for a person on the street, this line does not exist, and therefore all the claims coming from closing opposition ought to stand in this round. Before I proceed, I'll take a POI from OG.
If it really is exclusionary, then it's worse on your side when you demonize machismo so much when it's internalized in these people's identities. If you want radical drag representation, you're more likely going to fall into the parlor gate trap or have no success because no one will compromise.
I don't think that is the case. If it is inherently exclusionary, therefore the most important response to this is to be able to have some form of community to at least resist the kind of exclusion that they have, resist the oppressive measures that they have. We have that in closing off because we do not ponder to these kinds of people in the first place. Therefore, we don't have like the divide that you have in opening a government and in closing government, wherein gays are just forced to choose between, so being a patriot, for example, or being not, or whatsoever. But the last thing that I'd like to note here is that our claim about righting humanity as a commonality is better. And they said, according to closing government, if this is true, they should have done this before and succeed. I would also can say the same thing about their claim, right? If it is true that it is like, it can be successful for patriotism to be the vehicle, for example, they should have done this before. But the reason as to why this kind of commonality is better is because this is a kind of messaging that you can repeat and repeat from generations to generations and wouldn't necessarily change, compared to the kind of patriotism that you have on their side, which is contingent to the kind of communication that the state first and foremost forward in the very first place. I.e., if the state says that patriotism looks like not questioning the state, or patriotism looks like not being able to just obeying before asking questions first, obeying before challenging the state first, that's how patriotism would look like, compared to how humanity as a commonality always looks like, which is if you're able to respect your neighbors, for example, if you're able to respect your neighbors or love them, for example, it is a good commonality. At the end of the speech, I was able to prove that this is overwhelmingly bad for the movement and we're better off without it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Thank you everyone for the debate. Cut across the floor and shake hands, but do whatever you do in lieu of that. More is high now to make a decision, so I could ask all the teams to please go back to the main room. Importantly, do not click the leave meeting button. Just click the leave breakout room button, and that'll take you back to the main room. We'll deliberate for about 15 minutes or so, and then come and grab you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, hi everyone, welcome back for the debate. Apologies that the deliberation took a little bit of time, but it's a testament to how close the debate was. We're going to do some general feedback, announce the result, and then go through the reasons for the result. First thing I will say, it was quite a close debate and quite a good debate at times, so teams should be happy with their performances. Let's go through the general feedback. I think the first thing this debate lacked a bit on was talking a lot more about the messaging aspect of this debate. Because so much of the impacts we're talking about, and to be clear, the debate was pretty good on impacts of what would be the benefits of a movement that is supported, what would be the benefits to individuals when they're recognized, etc. But a lot more work needed to be done on how we actually get there. So it's good general stuff with any social messaging debate to think about who exactly is sending the message. How are they sending it? Is it interrupted by a media personality or some commentary or newspapers or whatever, or is it directly to someone? And then who is the person receiving that message? How do they already think about the world? What are their perceptions? What are they likely to be influenced by? And how they're likely to respond to things. Dealing a lot more with that element would definitely, I think, help teams improve in the debate today. I think the teams that did better in the results are the teams who got closer to doing that. I think the second thing in the debate is teams did spend a fair bit of time doing framing at points in their speeches, which was quite good and useful. But at times it was quite a lengthy amount of framing. And for me personally, that's the question of where is this framing going? Because it's not actually proving an argument yet, it's just setting up things. So I think it's useful just from a time management perspective or an impact perspective to sort of say, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to frame X thing. This will be important because it does this. Now let's frame it. That way you're setting the judge up to understand where your framing is going and they can start following along more easily. Because at times otherwise it seems like, well, why are we still recharacterizing these different elements in the debate if they're not going to actually lead to an outcome? And the third thing is just to make sure teams are being particularly responsive to all the best versions and nuances of each other's cases. And I think that the better responsiveness in the debate would have come with the first piece of feedback around analysing incentives and social of the social messaging and how people are likely to receive it. All right, in terms of the results then, we eventually came to a consensus decision. The first went to opening opposition, the second went to closing opposition, the third went to closing government, and the fourth went to opening government. Let's run through the decisions now. Let's talk about OO and why OO takes the first in today's debate. Looking first at the top half, I think the first big question here is on the capacity to change and whether or not, which side of the debate is likely to lead to better change for LGBT movements in the developing world. I think by the end of the top half, both teams did a decent job of kind of disproving each other's cases. So we're not hugely convinced there's going to be a significant amount of change by using patriotism or necessarily in the absence of patriotism. That's due to a couple of things. I think one, Gov does a lot of good work in setting up why the status quo is not likely to trend particularly positively, but unfortunately then just kind of asserts their own responses to that. So it's just kind of like, well, the status quo is bad, we add patriotism, we fix it, but it's really unclear how those links work. But it also means it's a bit hard to see how opening opposition works at times. Opening opposition does posit forward the argument around getting the support of other anti-government groups and why that is more likely to be helpful. I think there is a missing link here from OO about why necessarily these groups are likely to be pro-LGBT, why these groups are likely to support them in the first place. But I think they do enough to suggest it is likely they might, because they all have anti-government incentives. They've all been targeted by the government before. And I think they also do prove that if we accept that first premise, then the second premise of being in favour of the patriotism in the state is likely to push them further away. I think there is maybe a definitional question here about, is patriotism linked just to the government or is it linked to the state overall? So how does that impact with policies? But I think both op teams do enough in the debate to suggest that it is conflated enough between the two that displaying a strong sense of patriotism might in some ways separate those groups. So at the end of that first part then, there's minimalized change, but if there is going to be any capacity for change, OO proves it is hurt by pushing off these groups. What I think happens then and becomes a higher priority given the lack of capacity of change is the material around how individual people in that community are likely to feel as a consequence. I think OG brings some good material around how lots of people feel torn or have, I think they call it cognitive dissonance between loving their country and their own identity. I think the problem here is from opening government is it still lacks that linking of well, just because the LGBT movement now says something patriotic, does that magically resolve all of the historical issues that led to that or the ingrained cultural issues that lead to that? So I think that's kind of where the OG falls down on this issue. Where we thought that OO starts to win in this issue is by talking about the fact that for lots of members of this community, the government and the state and the country has been quite an oppressive force upon them. So any sort of alignment with or support of or ingraining of patriotic messages is actually quite antagonistic to the movement and is likely to lead to a fracturing of the movement and a hurting of individuals. So at that point, then I think they have a far more concrete harm that we are able to weigh in the debate. So what that means, I think that OO is then able to sort of win the top half on those two things. I think when we carry on to bringing in closing government and why they beat closing government, I think that also sort of responds to the big chunks of that. When we look at the closing government talking about why a link to patriotism is likely to be more successful, I think right from the start in the OO case, they point out issues with the skepticism this is likely to bring with it, how people are already likely to have ingrained stances separate to patriotism. That means they're not necessarily going to immediately support this just because it is patriotic. And while CG does add more mechanisms, which we'll come to later, so I don't think they're able to successfully get over opening opposition. And the last thing with opening opposition is how they take out their their closing. We thought this was a pretty close split. However, there are a couple of areas in which we think OO takes out CO. The first, I think, is just they have a far clearer path to some degree of victory. So we're talking about alignment with other groups and trying to, if not align, at least not have them dislike the LGBT movement. I think CO undercooks their alternative of focusing broadly on human rights groups. So the problem there is, I think, one, it's just a bit underdone in terms of analysis. It's given in the last 45 seconds of both speeches. But secondly, it's core analysis of there is another group that shares similar values of being anti-state or this other similar value of human rights. We can align with them. If we align with state, they don't like us, we don't get their support, is all basically the same mechanisms as OO with just a different label of labor movements versus HR, human rights groups. There's obviously a big difference between those two. And I think it would be easy to, with a bit of time spent on it, could untangle and not make that derivative, but not enough is done in the debate. So it was hard to credit that as being a more persuasive mechanism from closing than opening. The second thing was around the skepticism responses we hear. I think maybe CO adds a little bit to this, which is helpful in them beating closing government. Doesn't add a whole lot on to what opening opposition has already said in their responses about why it is unlikely that these groups who are anti-LGBT will suddenly change their opinion just based upon the fact that you are likely to be patriotic, use patriotic messaging. So then I think the internal impacts of the movement still help to override against their closing. So that's why OO takes the first in today's debate. Let's look then at the second and why, and bring in closing opposition here in the debate. So I've kind of covered a bit of their extension already, but let's have a look at particularly the closing half and comparing the two extensions that have already happened. So the first thing in the bottom half I want to talk about is this alternative of focusing on human rights. I've dealt with why it was probably needed a bit more work to stand stronger in the debate. So it was a bit unclear and hard to weigh in the debate. But I think additionally, closing government provides some good responses to it around like, why is it necessarily mutually exclusive? Why would people buy in? So I think at this point, the alternatives from CO aren't the thing that is winning them the closing half of today's debate. And maybe that's a narrow win to CG on that issue. Where does CO start to beat out CG though? I think the first thing they do is the responses around who is likely to support the movement. I think they do a good amount of work to prove why Conservatives are not likely to actually support these groups, which does a good job of responding to the closing government extensions around buying into political powers and buying into like public support with patriotism. So I think like the idea for CG is, well, we can use social messaging to pressure Conservative governments to change their behaviour and self-interest. But the opposite mech that CO points out, well, Conservative governments might also do it the other way and campaign against them, and might also be very sceptical of the way in which people are trying to manipulate patriotic messaging. Also probably means it's unlikely they get these people on side simply by using this mechanism. I think there is more space for rebuttal here and more work that could have been done, but I think ultimately it was sufficient to respond to the extent of the argument as given by the government bench. The last thing that CO raises is this question around patriotism as being a particularly weak kind of messaging, given that people are likely to be distrustful of the state and distrustful of the nation. Again, CG raises those definitional questions of like, well, they can love their nation, but not necessarily the government and the way it's acting. But for me, the way that CO explains it is less about specifically the government, more about the conditions in that country and the way the country is treated individuals, which means it might not be as successful a level of messaging, particularly given the context of those groups. So I think at this point then, CO has done enough to disrupt any extension material that CG has on why they're likely to get more change with patriotic messaging, which is enough for them to get up over closing government. And also, I think opening government in a similar vein, so as I'll come to in a second, I don't think there's there's not a huge amount of difference between the government bench teams, which means that sort of rebuttal that applies to CG also helps knock out OG. The last thing I'll add on that long diagonal split is just in terms of the effects as well, is like it is easier to see the impacts to the LGBT movement from CO's extension around how Conservatives will not be happy with as an act than it is to see any potential benefits from aligning to patriotism, which again meant it was harder to credit the OG material in that split because it was harder to see a more concretized link to the outcomes. All right, so that answers why CO gets the second. Let's lastly look then at why CG takes out their opening to wrap up this adjudication. So I think the first thing I note about opening government is they do a good job of identifying the problem that is faced by LGBT movements in the developing world, well, at least in their conception of the developing world countries we're talking about in the debate. When they talk about how people have historical differences, it's seen as like the West and cultural intervention, and they're also likely to be fearful of what are like quote unquote outsider groups. I think the biggest problem, though, is that there is quite a problem solution gap from the opening government team. That means it's quite assertive as to how just adding patriotism into that mix achieves change. So the big problem there is just lack of characterization about the types of messaging, who we're trying to target that messaging, who's making those messages, etc., which makes it hard to believe the connection between the two things. If we look at the closing government extension, I think they do the best job at filling in those gaps in the government bench today. So they talk about a lot of different reasons as to characterizations and suggestions as to why that messaging is likely to be effective. So they talk about things like common narratives of suffering. They look at building narratives and stories of success, respecting soldiers, etc. They look at Olympians and trying to build that nation around them, and also things like how patriotism is likely to be an all-unifying message, which if you include LGBT in is likely to try and include them. I think this stuff is still from some of the assertiveness problems, and as I've detailed in the other splits, is ultimately not hugely successful in the debate, but it does add that extra layer of detailed characterization and goes further than opening government does in trying to prove that there is likely to be a metric for change and a possible change with using patriotism, which is why they're able to take out their opening government in the debate today. All right, sorry that was a bit lengthy, but I hope that all made sense. If anyone would like any further feedback or has any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or either of the panelists. The best way to contact me is on Discord, but otherwise, well done on the debate today. I will try and get back feedback to you in the next couple of hours, but I can't guarantee it will be before the next debate, unfortunately. But otherwise, well done and best of luck for the rest of Worlds.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.